Welcome back, everybody. We're looking forward to starting this next session of Day 3 of the Sparks 2014 conference. We're looking at science in training, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Clive Wynne. Clive is a professor of psychology at Arizona State University and director of research at Wolf Park, Indiana. He has studied animal behaviour in Britain, Germany, the US, and Australia in species ranging from pigeons to dunnarts, which for the people who aren't familiar with Australian marsupials is a tiny little mouse-sized marsupial. Several years ago, he founded the Canine Cognition and Behaviour Lab, dedicated to the study of dogs and their wild relatives. He's often quoted in print media and radio, and his science has been featured on several TV shows. He's the author of a textbook, Animal Cognition, now in a new edition, and he is editor-in-chief of the journal Behavioural Processes. His most recent book is Do Animals Think? Please join me in welcoming Clive.
Thank you, Mia. A warm introduction. I'm so excited to finally have my own chance in the limelight. I've been having a great time up in the balcony listening to everybody else's talk and answering for an opportunity to be up here myself. So learning theory, dog training. You guys know all about this, right? You've seen these things before. There'll be a test afterwards, so we won't spend too long looking at that slide. It's good stuff, right? It's useful. It helps you comprehend and structure how you reinforce animals for doing what you want them to do. But I'm going to step back. I don't want to tell you what I believe you already know about. I want to tell you about some things that I hope that you haven't heard so much about. Let's do a little bit of history. Let's roll back the clock to when B.F. Skinner first suggested that you could use learning principles to help you train a dog to do something useful. And he did this in an article in Scientific American in 1951. And in that article, he suggested that you could use what he called a cricket. You could use a cricket to get a dog to do something that the dog would not otherwise be doing. And here's an illustration from the Scientific American article which shows you a cricket in somebody's hand and a dog in different phases of being trained to touch the handle of this cabinet. So what on earth is this cricket thing? I have to Google this. And it's not easy because obviously, you've got cricket, you've got the game of my old country, you've got all sorts of things. So it turns out this is 1951, right? This is only 5 years after the end of the Second World War, 6 years. A cricket was a clicker. That's where he got the idea from. That's where the idea of the clicker originally comes from. And the cricket was something that was issued to US paratroopers during the D-Day landings, and they were to go once, and if there was another paratrooper hiding nearby, he was to go twice in response. That's where the idea of using a clicker as a bridge in dog training came from. And so Skinner, in this Scientific American article, he describes in detail and a rich engaging prose, how you would do this, giving the strong impression to the reader that he had done it. Skinner is famous enough that there are historians of science who specialize in Skinner. And the consensus among historians of science is that at the time that Skinner wrote the article, he had not, in fact, tried it. But the article was successful, and so he was soon after contacted by a writer from Look magazine. And Look magazine, so for the younger viewers, a magazine, that's where people used to have information printed onto sheets of paper which were bound together with glue or staples. So before there was the internet, this is how we used to learn things. And Look was one such object, and it had a whole range of light topics and a lot of photographs. It was primarily a magazine of big photos and short texts. And so a writer and photographer from Look magazine contacted Professor Skinner, having read the Scientific American piece, and said, "This sounds fantastic. I want to come up and see you at Harvard as soon as possible, along with my cameraman, and see how you train dogs to do things." And so now Skinner's in a bit of a bind. But a very, very smart guy. And the first thing is that he fully recognizes that it's all going to be about the photographs. And in those days, again, you know, for the younger people watching and listening, you used to have to use a special metallic case called a camera, and in that we had a long sheet of plastic which was coated with special light-sensitive chemicals, which we called film. And the light-sensitive chemicals were not as light-sensitive as the sensors that we now have in our cell phones. And so you needed to have a large, powerful flashlight that also made a substantial crack sound each time you shot a picture. And so the photographer actually brings a dog with him, and the dog's official name was Road Coach Cheerful, better known as Agnes. And as you can see, Agnes was a Dalmatian. And the first thing Skinner does is he doesn't get his cricket back out. No, he gets hold of a flash gun and he establishes the flash sound is going to be the bridge. So there's no click, there's the flash sound. And he chooses, as a behavior that he's going to demonstrate for the magazine, getting the dog to jump up. And so there's a sequence. So I can tell from the laughter that you already recognize something there, which I'll come to. For those who don't recognize it, we'll keep them in suspense. So he has the dog against a wall with some lines marked on it so that you can see. And each time the dog gets anywhere close to moving in the vertical dimension, flash goes the camera, and the dog gets a treat. There's the dog just looking up. There's the dog with its head in a substantially raised pose after 8 minutes. There's the dog on its hind legs rearing up. There's the dog almost jumping up. And within 20 minutes, Agnes has her feet off the ground, and he's done it. And it makes a tremendous impression on the photographer, and Skinner has pulled it off. He has convinced the world that you can train a dog to do something that it wouldn't previously have done by using his new technique of operant conditioning. Now, I assume that the titter that came through the hall when I said that Skinner is going to train the Dalmatian to jump up comes from those of you that work with Dalmatians, because, in fact, presumably Skinner knew this, jumping up is rather a nuisance in Dalmatians. It's more likely to be a behavior that you're going to want to eradicate from a Dalmatian than a behavior that there is any real necessity to train a Dalmatian to do. Dalmatians are prone to unwanted jumping up. So what a clever guy. The ingenuity of thinking of the technique, the chutzpah of writing an article in Scientific American making it seem like you've done it when all the evidence is that he hadn't in fact tried it yet, and then getting a Dalmatian, recognizing that the Dalmatian is going to be very easy to get to jump up, and even the idea of temporarily using the flash sound on the camera as your bridge instead of the clicker, which is what he had originally proposed in the Scientific American article. So that's a little bit of history, which I thought you might find interesting. What I want to tell you about is some ways that my students and I have been using principles of conditioning in ways which, to the best of my knowledge, have not been tried before, certainly not in the scientific literature, although, of course, imaginative dog behaviorists are trying new things all the time. So I want to tell you about a technique that was derived from Skinnerian principles that an erstwhile colleague of mine, Brian Iwata, developed. And the work I'm going to tell you about is the work of Sasha Protopopova and Nathan Hall. And they identified canine compulsive disorder as a behavioral problem that they wanted to apply their skills to dealing with. And canine compulsive disorder, which is defined as I've got here, we're going to talk about a dog that has a light chasing problem. It can take many different forms, and all the different forms considered, it's actually quite a common problem. 2% of all cases that show up in a veterinary surgery are canine compulsive disorder. Not 2% of all the behavioral problems, 2% of all the cases that show up in a veterinary clinic. So it's quite a widespread problem. And so until very recently, I was at the University of Florida, where it was my pleasure and honor to be a colleague of Professor Brian Iwata, who is quite famous in applied behavior analysis for developing a technique that he calls functional analysis. From the point of view of somebody who follows Skinner's ideas, it is axiomatic that a great many behaviors, even undesired and unwelcome behaviors, occur because they are reinforced, they are rewarded by some consequence that occurs in the environment. Brian has never worked with dogs. He's always worked with handicapped children, especially autistic children. And here is an example of data from one of the first times he used his then new technique, as I say, called functional analysis. And the assumption is that all behaviors, or most behaviors, occur because they are reinforced. And so can we design a technique to uncover what it is that is reinforcing any particular behavior? And so here is a case of a child recorded as Nellie, and Nellie has the undesirable behavior of acting up in class and disrupting class proceedings. Why would a child do that? You talk to the teacher, you apply your prior knowledge of the kinds of things that reinforce this kind of behavior in kids, and Brian proposed two possible consequences that might be supporting this behavior. One possibility is escape. That is to say, that means not that the child actually escapes from the room, but that by being disruptive, the child effectively escapes from whatever it is being expected to do in the class. Whatever the classroom work is, the child has escaped from that by misbehaving. Another possibility is that the child's behavior is reinforced by teacher attention, even though the attention most likely takes the form of some sort of chastisement. Nellie, stop doing that. That attention could nonetheless be rewarding to the child, and in a control condition, no consequences were provided to the child. And so in successive 10-minute sessions, one consequence is willfully provided to the child each time she misbehaves. So quite intentionally, Nellie was allowed to cease working on her task each time she misbehaved, in each of these sessions plotted with a filled square. And quite intentionally, Nellie was provided with attention in each of the sessions plotted with an open circle, and in the filled circle sessions, no consequences were provided. And so you can see that, in fact, in the case of Nellie, providing attention is exactly what it is that is supporting Nellie's misbehavior. So this technique was developed 30 years ago with autistic and other handicapped children, but had never before, at least in the scientific literature, been applied to dogs. And so Nathan and Sasha made friends with Paisley. Paisley, a lovely 3-year-old boxer, but with an extreme light-chasing compulsion. So extreme that Paisley cannot wear a dog tag, because if the light catches and reflects off his dog tag, he charges around trying to catch this reflected light, and he has broken his own teeth by ramming himself into the floor with such power that he cracked his own teeth, and he knocks over and breaks things in the house all the time. It's a very problematic issue that Paisley has, this otherwise super sweet dog. So Nathan and Sasha design a functional analysis for Paisley. And so what they're going to do, we went ahead too far. What they're going to do is they're going to have 3 conditions. In one condition, each time Paisley moves for the light, goes for the light, they're going to move and shake the light around for 10 seconds. In a second condition, each time Paisley jumps for the light, they're going to turn it off. And in a third condition, they can fix the light so that it does not go out and it does not move, and that's our control condition. So I'll show you first a snippet from the movement condition. So that's Nathan kneeling there. He moves the line for 10 seconds every time Paisley tries to touch it. And you can see that Paisley is trying to touch it more or less continuously. So that's the movement condition, just a snippet. Then we have the removal condition, and now each time Paisley jumps for the light, Nathan's going to turn it off. So they do this. I won't bother showing you a video of the control condition. There's nothing much to see in that. And so they do this repeatedly over the course of a week. And I'm going to show you a graph. And in that graph, you're going to see how often Paisley jumps on the light under each of these three different conditions. So the percent of intervals with light chasing, up from 0 to 100%. And we have a total of 25 sessions where they were testing this out. And so here are the sessions where Nathan moved the light each time Paisley jumped for it. And you can see that the movement leads to a very, very high rate of chasing of the light. Then we have the removal of the light. The light is turned off every time Paisley goes for it. And you can see that this seems to support an intermediate level of activity from Paisley. But we were uncertain and somewhat concerned that what we might be seeing here, this intermediate level, might be spillover from the movement sessions. And so what we did was we presented 3 removal successions in succession with no movement session. And you can see that under those conditions, the behavior is dying out. The behavior is extinguishing. So we don't think that, in fact, the removal is important. And then we have the control condition, and in the control condition, there is very little chasing of the light. So this is interesting. This is good. We're making progress. We think we have an understanding of why Paisley chases the light. And it would seem to suggest that it probably ties in with sort of hunting patterns of behavior, that the movement of the light might perhaps be like a movement of prey. And so it's a very prepared behavior for a dog to chase after prey. Well, knowledge is good, but knowledge is not treatment. We haven't cured Paisley of anything by knowing what he does, and since this is a natural contingency, it would be very difficult for us to create a world for Paisley in which lights never move, right? I mean, shadows and reflections, it would be very difficult to create that world. So what can we do? Well, we go back to Dr. Iwata and we ask for his advice, and he says, well, can you train an incompatible response? Can you train the dog to do something which would, I don't want to say take its mind off chasing the light, but we could put it that way, but it would be technically better just to say an incompatible response, some other behavior that will get in the way of trying to chase the light. And so we think about this, and Nathan and Sasha come up with the idea of training Paisley to wave his paw on command, which they succeed in doing in 10 minutes flat. It's very easy to train Paisley to wave his paw. And now we bring the light back in, initially dimly and gradually brighter and brighter, all the time reinforcing Paisley for waving his paw. And what they find is that this works extremely well. And in just half an hour, Paisley is now happy to wave his paw at people and just ignore and forget about the whole idea of chasing the light. So here now is Paisley. There's that light that previously drove him nuts. And instead of chasing the light, he's enthusiastically giving his paw. So, very pleasing, very satisfying. Now, okay, that's only one dog. That's only one problem behavior. Let's look at some more problem behaviors. You may have seen this one before. So these are the royal deer in the parkland around Windsor Castle. And so the excited gentleman has every reason to be anxious because harassing the Queen's deer is actually the only crime for which capital punishment is in fact still used in the British Isles. Nobody has been hung since 1715, but it's still on the books if your dog harasses royal deer. So how does that come to be? How does this dog come to have this elaborate pattern of behavior? Well, I think it's obvious to those of you that have been paying attention. I've introduced you, briefly reminded you of Skinner's 4 quadrants of reinforcement. Clearly, this man started in his backyard with a dog that didn't want to move at all, and he would show it cutouts of deer, perhaps, move them a little bit, and reinforce the dog for closer and closer, perhaps with a clicker, reinforce the dog for closer and closer approximations to this final elaborately choreographed performance, right? Right? It's obviously how this works. Well, okay, so it's obviously not how this works. Certain behaviors, behaviorists, Skinnerians like to say, are self-reinforcing. So we presume that the dog just finds it immensely satisfying to chase deer, and that there is absolutely no need to provide any additional reinforcement. Indeed, I'm being completely facetious and stupid, because clearly the last thing that man would be doing would be, at least intentionally, providing reinforcement for his dog for chasing the Queen's deer. So behaviorists have a terminology, automatic reinforcement, but if you think about it, it's a completely vacuous terminology. There's no content, no explanatory power in describing a behavior as self-reinforcing. If we want to make sense of those kinds of behaviors, I think we need to shift our conceptual gears. And I think the conceptualization where we're going to do best in making sense of behaviors that animals engage in spontaneously and that appear to be self-reinforcing or without the need for any external reinforcement. And others, Simone and others have spoken about this school before, it's ethology. That's the study of the spontaneous behaviors of animals, and as I believe has already been mentioned, founded by Konrad Lorenz, author of a book on dogs, famous for imprinting, social imprinting, many photographs of Lorenz being followed by young animals, especially geese, that have been imprinted on him. However, I was very pleased when I found this photograph because it combines his interest in geese with his interest in dogs. And you know how you Google for an image and you find the image you want and you just snatch it? And only later do you think, well, I wonder what else was on that page. Maybe this is an interesting page. Maybe I would learn more about Lorenz and his dogs. So I'll go back, I'll have a look. So it turns out that this comes from a web page of somebody who likes photoshopping their puppy into famous photographs. So this is not Lorenz's dog, even though it's very plausible. I mean, we know he had dogs. I think Bradley mentioned that Lorenz had a dingo, you know, but not this particular dog. This particular dog is also available, sleeping on the foot of the bed with Yoko Ono and John Lennon having their love-in. But anyway, Konrad Lorenz and Nico Tinbergen, no photos of Tinbergen with a dog. I don't know for sure whether Tinbergen had a pet dog. Certainly as a behavioral theorist, he was considerably less interested in the behavior of pets. Lorenz was always very interested in the behavior of pets and had many pets, Tinbergen less so. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to teach you ethology because A, I'm sure you already know about it, and B, I know I'm not the first person up who's introduced ethological terminology. Just very, very quickly, just for completeness sake, what seems characteristic of ethology is it talks about the behaviors that animals spontaneously carry out. And Simone talked about, I think it was Simone, I'm now not quite sure, but somebody spoke about the terminology of instinct. Yes, it was Simone. The terminology of instinct, which is a common language term, right, for behaviors that occur without any training or learning and are relatively inflexible and not influenced by personal experience. And over time, it became clear that there were no or very few behaviors that really fit this definition. And so the definition was broadened and softened to talk about modal action patterns of behavior, behaviors that are relatively fixed in a species, relatively inflexible, relatively independent of environmental feedback. And I have this photograph of a goose returning an egg to the nest. But Simone actually had, if you remember, the old movie film from Tim Bergen and Lawrence's studies showing how the bird, mother bird, makes the actions of returning the egg to the nest, even if you snatch the egg away while she's in the middle of moving it. But her pattern of behavior is so inflexible that she doesn't adapt to deal with that. So ethology is terrific for understanding the things that animals do spontaneously, but I'm going to suggest that ethology as a school is not that much use to us when we're trying to change animals' behavior. It can help us in the sense that it provides us with an understanding of the underpinnings of patterns of behavior, but it doesn't offer recipes for changing behavior. Most of the recipes that I hear of in North America concern Skinner's principles of operant conditioning, but there's an older school of conditioning. There's an older school of conditioning that was actually discovered in dogs. And that, hence my title. Does the name Pavlov ring a bell? And Pavlov was actually a deep and wide-ranging philosopher, not just a dog scientist, as, for example, exemplified in this lesser-known quote, "Physical lustiness is the necessary condition for powerful mental activity." And that's Ivan Petrovich Pavlov, who lived 1849 to 1936, a really fascinating character. He was also an enthusiastic sportsman and a thoughtful commentator on sporting activities, as shown in the next slide. Approving a good ball of a player from his team, Pavlov to yield enthusiastically, "You are a star." But he was in depth of despair if someone missed the ball. "You are a kneading trough. You play as a woman. It's time for you to live in a nursery home, sir." So he was a little older by the time he was making these famous quotes. And I also suspect these quotes come from the website of the museum that is in Pavlov's birthplace in Russia, and I have a suspicion that they used Google Translate to translate what Pavlov actually said into English. But seriously, I have recently, and particularly influenced by my student Sasha Protopopova, been paying more attention to Pavlov, and I think there's a lot more that Pavlov can help us with dogs than you would imagine if all you know about Pavlov is this kindly old man photograph and what he actually did with dogs and saliva. By the way, 2 of Pavlov's dogs survive to this day in museums in Russia, stuffed. They're not really alive. And I visited Moscow, but unfortunately I didn't get to the Moscow Darwin Museum, which is where that particular dog, one of Pavlov's subjects, still lives. So, okay, you're going to say, well, you have a dim memory from school of, you ring a bell and the dog slobbers and, well, so what, right? I mean, so what? What can you do with that? What is that good for? Well, actually, Pavlovian conditioning principles are a lot more useful than I think they've been given credit for. And Sasha in particular, and it's an interesting sort of nature versus nurture thing, is Sasha so well informed about Pavlov? Is it genetic because she was born in Russia? Or is it because of her excellent American education? Something we could discuss. It probably is both. Okay, so we're going to take Pavlovian principles and we're going to take them to the pointy end of dog welfare. And the pointy end of dog welfare in our world today is the shelter. That's where over 10% of all the dogs in the United States today are in cages, in shelters. That probably means about 9 million dogs today are in shelters. And it's extremely difficult to get truly reliable numbers, but it seems likely that about half of them don't make it out alive. So this is very, very much the pointy end of dog welfare. So let's see what we can do if we take the principles that Ivan Pavlov discovered by accident in dogs in the 1880s and take them into shelters and see if we can do something useful. So, this was in the New Yorker just a couple of weeks ago. Okay. Sasha has done a number of studies which I'm not going to fill you in on the details because they were an immense amount of work, but all that really matters is the outcome. Sasha made videos of dogs in shelters, coded everything those dogs do when a person walks up to their cage, and then correlated what the dogs did and what became of them, so that we know which behaviors people who are looking for a dog at a shelter are actually influenced by. And it's not the things you might have thought. So, for example, if the dog knows how to sit, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. It's not important. Here's what's important. If you want to get adopted out of a shelter, you need to come to the front of the kennel, you need to face front, don't lean on or lick the walls or the bars of the cage. The licking turns people off. I put not barking separately because in her study there was no evidence that the barking actually influenced the chance of adoption, but I think that's because all the dogs were barking all the time, and even if the dog in front of you was not barking, the dog right next to it would be barking, and the barking is just so unpleasant that we've included reducing barking as one of our targets, even though it did not directly come out of her study. So we have some target behaviors. We believe that if we could get dogs to get to the front, face front, and avoid leaning and licking the walls, they would get adopted faster and with a higher rate. Well, okay, many of you are dog trainers, so you know how to do this, right? But I'm sorry to tell you this, you're too expensive. Shelters don't have much by way of spare resources. They're not going to hire professional dog trainers. Is there any other way, any cheap thing that we could do that would improve the dog's chances of getting out alive? Well, one thing you may have heard, if you have any connection to shelters, is there's a phrase shelters say, they say, a tired dog is a happy dog. And so they encourage people to come and exercise their dogs in the belief that by keeping the dogs exercise, the dogs will behave better and be more likely to get adopted. Well, Sasha, in her original study, had spent thousands of hours at the shelter looking at the dogs closely, watching what goes on. And she was actually skeptical about this. Let's formalize the phrase, a tired dog is a happy dog, into a scientific-sounding hypothesis. And here's what this hypothesis could be called. It could be called the exercise hypothesis, and it could be put like this. If the animals are deprived of exercise, that leads to an increase in unattractive behavior like locomotion, vocalization. And so the prediction is increase exercise, decrease unattractive behavior. That's a prediction. But Sasha had an idea. She thought, if people take the dogs out for exercise, the people become what Pavlov called a conditioned stimulus, like the bell in the original salivation experiment. And if the people predict that you're going to be taken out for exercise, maybe that leads to too much excitement in the dogs, and actually it leads to bad behavior. And if that hypothesis has any validity, it leads to an alternative strategy. And that alternative strategy is calm interaction. If the human plus exercise and food leads to excitement, then maybe the human will produce unattractive behavior. So if you want to decrease the unattractive behavior, that is what we want, right? Then what you need to do is you need to bring humans in for calm interactions. Not exercise, not excitement, but calm interactions. And so what she did was she set up an experiment where some dogs got 15 minutes a day of exercise, and other dogs had the exciting experience of volunteers reading in their presence. Not even reading out loud, just sitting down and reading for 15 minutes, right? And so she did a nicely controlled, crossed over thing where there's 2 weeks of baseline, either before or after one of the two interventions. And then she video records the dogs all the time. And here's what she found. So here is a space where 0 means that the dog's behavior has not changed. -100 means that the dog's unattractive behaviors have been completely wiped out. There's no more nasty behavior. And plus 100 means the dogs are doing nothing but nasty behavior the whole 2 minutes of the observation period. Okay? So you do exercise, it doesn't actually make any darn difference at all. Whereas you do calm interaction, and the unattractive behaviors are reduced by over 40%. So she was right. Calm interaction with the dogs leads to much more attractive, successful, profitable outcomes than the exercise intervention. So that's great, right? We've got a simpler intervention. You don't have to be trained, well, you don't have to be trained to exercise with the dog, but you certainly don't have to be trained to just sit still and read with the dog. Oh, and by the way, all the dogs still got their standard baseline exercise. The dogs were not deprived of exercise, they just were not getting these additional exercise sessions. And so, is a tired dog a happy dog? Well, the dog may be happy, but it is not a dog that is behaving in ways that will get it adopted. However, if you spend time at the shelter, you've always got to be aware it's too easy as a psychologist to come in and propose things that would be wonderful at the shelter. You've always got to think about, well, what would this cost? How expensive is this intervention to an institution which is always strapped for resources? And thinking about it that way, we realized that this was a rather, even though it doesn't require an expert dog trainer, it's nonetheless a rather expensive and time-consuming way of trying to help the dogs. But it did make us think that this Pavlovian procedure has some potential. So let's think about it some more. Let's see where we can go with this. Okay, if you want the dogs to behave well, the most direct thing to do would be to train them, by which we mean using operant principles and reinforcement, perhaps clickers, train them. I already said that that's likely to be expensive, but it's the direct approach. And it would look like this. In some technical terms, which if they're not familiar to you, don't matter, operant treatment would mean some kind of a signal, see the dog reduce levels of inappropriate behavior, and provide a reward. Right? That's what operant training looks like. Then you test whether it worked by providing the stimulus on its own and seeing if it works. See if your training worked. That's the standard. Now, many of you are experts in doing this. You may also have the experience from time to time of trying to explain to non-experts, dog owners whose dogs are not behaving well perhaps, how you do it. And so you'll know that it's not easy. It's not easy being a good dog trainer. It takes a significant grasp of observational skills, and you've got to be able to respond with the reinforcement at the right moment. Even an extra second of delay, and you're now reinforcing a different behavior. It's not easy. Pavlovian contingencies, Pavlovian processes are much, much simpler to implement. In a Pavlovian treatment, you provide what Pavlov called the conditioned stimulus, a stimulus that you wouldn't in itself expect to produce any behavior. And we used a bell because it's just unbelievably cute to be able to say that we're doing a Pavlovian experiment with a bell and dogs. It hasn't been done for a century. It's just too cute to ignore. But here's the thing. So here's the dog. What's my motivation? Why does the dog do anything that you want it to do? With the Pavlovian system, you're losing control over the behavior, right? Because you're not saying, I'm only giving you the biscuit if you sit down and act nice. You're not saying that. You're saying, I'm going to ring the bell, give you the biscuit, and I'm just going to hope you're going to behave nicely, right? If the dog behaves nicely, great. If the dog doesn't behave nicely, what are you going to do? In the Pavlovian game, you give up control. You're just trusting to the god of dogs. And so, again, don't worry about the terminology if it's not familiar to you because you don't need to learn it. But We expect the dog, when you put food in its mouth, to what? Eat the food, slobber a bit, sometime later poop, you know? Why does that mean that the bell leads to anything desirable? Well, it doesn't. There's no logical reason why the bell is going to lead to anything desirable. We're just going to try it and see. We're just going to try it and see. And meanwhile, because this is the kind of people we are, we're going to have a control condition where we just go around ringing a bell, and in the test, we go around ringing a bell. Just in case, maybe it's a little-known fact, but maybe dogs just act nice when you ring bells at them, you know? Maybe. Seems unlikely, but we feel compelled to test these kinds of things. So, what's really at stake here is we have the operant treatment that we have every reason to believe will work. It's not really in question. We have the Pavlovian treatment where we don't have a clue what we're doing. We're just trying it. You know, it doesn't sort of make a lot of intuitive sense, but maybe it works. We know what we want the dogs to do, or better said, to not do. We know which behaviors get dogs out of shelters, right? And I showed you that some slides back. That we want them to stop barking, stop licking the sides of their cage, come to the front, and look to the front. That's what we want them to do. So we're taking a punt here, that by pairing a bell with food, it will lead to dogs that will not lick the side of their cage, but come to the front of their cage, not bark, and look friendly towards the front. We're taking a punt. Here are the results. As you can see, the operant treatment leads to the largest reduction in bad behavior. It leads to a reduction of nearly 60%. But the Pavlovian treatment leads to a reduction of bad behavior of over 40%. And meanwhile, the control animal is just ringing the bell. It doesn't do anything. And so, okay, the operant does look a little bit better than the Pavlovian, but actually, you know, we have statistics. We can test these things. There's no difference between the operant and the Pavlovian in a statistical comparison. The two of them are the same, and they are both significant improvements compared to the control condition. So what this shows us is that the Pavlovian, goodness knows how, goodness knows why, but the Pavlovian does work. It leads to a significant reduction in the bad behaviors that dogs in shelters often show to people who come and visit them. So this is very exciting because, again, remember, the operant treatment requires somebody with dog training skills who's a careful observer of behavior and is able to provide reinforcements on a punctual system so that the animal is getting the reward for doing good and not getting a reward for doing bad. The Pavlovian, on the other hand, all you need for the Pavlovian is some idiot who's capable of ringing a bell with one hand and throwing in some treats with the other hand. Anybody can do that. You can have high school volunteers go around doing that. That's very, very simple. It doesn't require expertise. So it's a promising technique for improving dogs' welfare. So this was done as an experiment, one dog at a time, which made it very time-consuming because we're analyzing the behavior of one dog at a time. Since then, Sasha has moved on to taking a whole wing of a shelter at a time, so that she gives treatment to one wing, leaves the other wing untreated, and then swaps it over. And so here's what that looks like. The shelter that she works at has two wings, side A and side B. First, she goes through doing a baseline assessment of the levels of bad behavior in the shelter when you just go around ringing a bell. And you can see that the dogs spend about half of their time acting bad when you're just walking around ringing a bell. Then she introduces the treatment, that's to say, pairs the bell with food on one side of the shelter, and you can see that the level of bad behavior roughly halves there, whilst on this side of the shelter, continuing along to not do anything, just continuing to collect the baseline. Then she introduces the treatment over on this side of the shelter, and it seems to show an even stronger impact on the behavior of the dogs on side A than it had originally shown to the treatment of the dogs on side B. So I find this tremendously exciting that this is showing us a novel method that has a real impact on the behavior of dogs in a county shelter And it's very, very simple to implement because it doesn't require anybody to actually look at the dogs. Obviously, we look at the dogs to collect these data, but nobody has to look at the dogs to apply the intervention. The intervention is just ring a bell, throw in food. Ring a bell, throw in food. You don't even have to have your eyes open while you're doing it. Okay? So it's a powerful technique. And what was the other thing I was going to say about it? Sorry. Maybe that's it. Maybe that's what I wanted to say about it. So, what I've tried to do for you in this brief presentation is remind you of some widespread techniques that are used, the Skinnerian techniques, mention the ethological background, but not go into it in any detail because I know that others have spoken about it, and because I don't feel, although I do think that the ethological approach is useful in understanding dogs' behavior, I don't see it so much as a tool in changing behavior. And then bring you back to the earliest school of animal conditioning, the Pavlovian school, which actually started with dogs. And there's a great temptation in science to look for a team, to look for a school that you find conducive. And then, once you've identified your school, your team, the others, they're complete idiots. You know? If you're a Skinnerian person, then usually the cognitive people are idiots, the ethologists are idiots. You have a sort of patronizing tolerance for the Pavlovian people. The Pavlovian people are like the highest priests, actually, when you meet them, and they think that their principles subsume everybody else's principles, and so it goes, and so it goes. But as I wrote in a great book that you could buy in the lobby here and take home several copies for your family, birthdays are coming up, science is not sports. We do not have to cheer for one team or another. On the contrary, this tribal attitude is quite antithetical to a scientific frame of mind. The purpose of the book, and this is my philosophy in general, is to come to a well-rounded appreciation of the minds of animals. And so I borrow what I find useful from all three schools of animal psychology. And really, I suppose, when I was writing that, I was lumping actually the operant and the Pavlovian together. By the three schools, I meant the sort of psychological, the conditioning, the cognitive, and the ethological. So, that is my take-home message, that you need to take whatever you can use from wherever you can find it, and that to think that your task as dog trainers, as people who care about dogs, as scientists, that the task is to identify one school and stick with it even when they're on a losing streak. That's a mistake. That's a mistake. We have to take whatever we can find from wherever we can find it. So I'm enormously fortunate that I work with a whole bunch of tremendously talented young people who are the actual engines that make it possible for me to have anything to say when I come out to events like this. But unfortunately, they're rather shy, and so the only photograph I have that represents my group is a photograph of all of their dogs. And at one stage, there was a photograph of Monique's ferret photoshopped into there, but I see the ferret has somehow fallen out. But I'm going to leave you with a photograph of Pavlov's group, because I find it such a fascinating picture to look at, and I spent a lot of time looking at it. So the old gray beard in the middle, that's obviously of Pavlov. But there are several things that are really interesting about this. One is that there's a dog, and all of the photographs of Pavlov's dogs, of Pavlov's group, always include, as a member of the group, one of his dogs. Now, he was a physiologist, right? His work involved cutting dogs open, work that would be quite repugnant to many of us. But he clearly had a tremendous affection for the dogs that he worked with. And so, very late in his life, the International Physiological Congress took place in Leningrad, St. Petersburg, his hometown. And they collected funds, and they wanted to build a statue for him. And he was furious. He was furious. And he said he forbade them to build a statue to him. He said he wanted a statue. If they had the money for a statue, he wanted a statue in memory of all of the dogs that had died in his experiments. And that was what was most important to him. and the statue still exists, and it has pictures of Pavlov and his students operating on dogs and text around it that says that he wants it to be recognized that he honors the dogs that gave their lives for his scientific inquiries. And he says that if the science you're doing, if it's not valuable, then you have committed a shameful crime in working with the animal. And so there's always a dog, and this particular rendition, it's not entirely clear, but it's usually quite identifiable that the dog is in a fairly relaxed pose, even though it's in one of the experimental harnesses. Another thing I want to draw to your attention is the remarkable fact that in almost all the photographs of groups of Pavlov students, about 1/3 are women. And so Pavlov was a scientist under the Tsars, right, in the 19th century. This would be from the 20th century under the communists. But originally he started out under the Tsars, and he was a professor at the St. Petersburg Military Medical Academy. And it was intrinsic to it being a military academy that women were not admitted as students, right? They didn't have women in the military in those days, and they certainly didn't train women as doctors in the military. But there was a women's medical academy in St. Petersburg, and one day, 2 women from the Women's Academy came and asked if they could join Pavlov's group and carry out research with him. And he sent them away with a flea in his ear, in their ears. And every morning, the lab would stop for morning tea. And so Pavlov sat down with the boys and told him the crazy story about the women that wanted to work in his laboratory. And he said, "We can't have women in the laboratory. They'd be crying everywhere," said Pavlov to the boys. And that's the day passes, and goes home. And the next morning he comes back, and it's morning tea again. And the boys in the lab want to pick up this theme of the crazy crying women who think they're going to come and do science in Pavlov's lab. And Pavlov interrupts him. He says, "No, I've thought about it. I've thought about it. We're taking the women." And from that day onwards, this was in the 1880s, from that day onwards, there were always women students being trained in Pavlov's lab. And indeed, by the end of his career, 1/3 of all the people he had trained had been women. And at his death, the succession involved 2 people, and one of them was a woman. Stern was her name. And she became the first female member of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, which sounds like a terrific high point to end the story on, but unfortunately to be a prominent individual in science in Stalin's Russia was not a great thing. And she ended up spending 15 years in the gulags in the 1950s, 40s and 50s. So anyway, Pavlov, I think, is a too overlooked figure and a great hero of mine, and I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.